Before you is the youngest son of the founder of one of the wealthiest countries on the planet, Singapore. At the end of 2024, he fled to Britain.
I was forced to seek asylum. I was the victim of persecution by the Singaporean authorities.
Because his older brother had started to turn into a dictator after 20 years of ruling Singapore. However, while the younger brother was seeking political asylum, the older one voluntarily stepped down from his post, just like their father did 35 years ago.
But we knew we had to do what was right, namely stand by what we have agreed in the Constitution. Thank you. Good night.
Their father, Lee Kuan Yew, in the 1970s turned a small island in Southeast Asia into the city of the future, where ministers earn the highest salaries in the world, but are also imprisoned for accepting gifts.
Transport Minister S. Iswaran has appeared in court today amid investigations for corruption.
In 1996, an anti-corruption investigation was conducted against Lee Kuan Yew himself. In the end, nothing was found, but can you imagine the leader of a country working for 30 years to turn it into the wealthiest city in the world, only for his own corruption laws to be used against himself? This is precisely why Singapore today has the lowest level of corruption in the world, on par with Canada and Switzerland. Singapore is the only example in the world where, without natural resources and with an authoritarian leader at the helm, the country leaped from the third world to the first in just a few decades.
Singapore is a meritocracy, and these men have risen to the top by their own merit, their hard work, and high performance.
Today, no neighboring country can compare to Singapore in terms of quality of life, where 80% of the population lives in government-built apartments, and banks and startups from all over the world line up to get permission to operate in the country.
Singapore's startup scene has made significant strides over the past year, jumping 10 spots to rank 8th worldwide in this year's.
However, every coin has two sides. For all the privileges ordinary Singaporeans have to pay with their personal freedom, it is almost impossible to buy a personal car there due to the high population density. The city's alleys are patrolled by robots, making sure nobody is smoking in the wrong place. And cameras are literally everywhere to ensure no one escapes justice for breaking the law and criticizing the government.
Because most people were afraid of criticizing him in fear of being found guilty by the judicial system that he controls.
Singapore imposes fines in the hundreds of dollars, sends people to prison, and sometimes applies corporal punishment.
In March, news a Singapore court had sentenced an 18-year-old American to 6 strokes with a bamboo cane.
And if you're a foreigner, even the intervention of your own country won't help you.
It's the first I've heard of it. I'll look into it.
Though it is precisely these toughness and authoritarian rule that has turned this small city in Southeast Asia into one of the most desirable places to live on the planet. I will tell you how to build a dictatorship without corruption that is respected by the whole world.
You know, some people think, oh, well, you know, we are a small place, they can put the screws on us. It's not so easy.
This is a small country squeezed in between Malaysia and Indonesia, Singapore. In fact, Singapore is a city smaller in size than London, but this does not prevent tiny Singapore from being among the top 10 richest countries in the world, even though it became an independent state only 60 years ago. And here is how it happened. After World War II, a third of the planet still formerly belonged to Europe. France owned Indochina and half of Africa. The Netherlands controlled modern-day Indonesia, and the British Crown ruled over Canada, Australia, India, East Africa, and modern Malaysia. But after the war, the former empires were exhausted, and nationalist movements for independence began in the colonies. Thus, Indonesia declared its sovereignty as early as August 1945. When the 10 million strong Netherlands tried to forcibly regain control over the 65 million strong Indonesia, it failed. In the jungles of the thousands of islands, Indonesian nationalists found it extremely convenient to wage a guerrilla war, which ultimately led to the recognition of the country's independence in 1949. In neighboring Malaya, which was part of the British Empire, communist ideas were gaining popularity. This was because about a third of the population were ethnic Chinese who had been moving there for decades to work at British plantations and mines for minimal wages while a civil war raged in their homeland. And when in 1949, Mao Zedong proclaimed the creation of the People's Republic of China, inspired by the success of the communists on the mainland, the local Malaysian Chinese began their struggle against the British colonial rule. Right in the middle of these wars for independence was Singapore, a British island colony just like Hong Kong. The tiny city was founded by the British back in 1819 and soon came under direct rule from London because of its unique location. The Singapore Strait is one of the most important routes for global trade, the shortest path from China to Europe, aside from the Arctic Ocean route. Despite its importance, the Singapore Strait is extremely narrow, only 16 kilometers or 10 miles wide, making it very easy to control. Overall, Singapore's harbors at the southern end of Malay Peninsula were ideally suited for the British as a transshipment point on the route between China and Europe. And when the Suez Canal opened in 1869, the journey, which previously took 6 months, was reduced to just 1. In short, Singapore's value skyrocketed, much like the price of an apartment next to a newly built subway station. Singapore itself was vastly different from its neighbors. 75% of its population was Chinese, whereas in modern-day Malaysia, they made up only 30%. You might ask, but where did so many Chinese people in Singapore come from? Chinese immigrants sought to reach Singapore, where they could get good jobs at the port. This was miles better than the horrors of the Chinese Civil War or the less lucrative work on rubber plantations in Malaya. Such ethnic composition led to this. When communists came to power in mainland China after World War II, many Chinese in Singapore became interested in Marxist ideas. Because of this, the British were in no hurry to grant Singapore independence, fearing that communists might come to power. Wait a minute, grant independence? But why would the British Empire even give up such an important trade hub? The thing is, the Great British Empire wasn't so great anymore after World War II. In 1949, India, the jewel of the British Crown, gained independence, followed a year later by neighboring Burma, now called Myanmar. Even colonial rule over modern Malaysia started to lose its meaning due to globalization. Let me explain. At the time, the territory of modern Malaysia was one of the leaders in rubber production. It was extracted from trees on plantations through incisions in the bark, and then the raw material was transported to Singapore. There, the rubber was loaded onto ships and sent to British factories, where it was processed into finished products, primarily automobile and bicycle tires. These tires were sold in Britain and exported to British colonies like India and Malaysia, including Singapore. And all this happened without competition from other countries, as Britain imposed protective barriers in its colonies to keep out foreign companies. However, in 1947, developed European countries, along with the United States and several other developing nations, signed a general agreement on tariffs and trade, a treaty that abolished trade barriers. You might ask, why would Britain agree to this? Why cancel such favorable conditions? The answer is simple. Back in 1941, the US and Britain signed the Atlantic Charter, an agreement stating that they would strive to create equal conditions for all nations, including free trade access. Thus, After the signing of the General Agreement, Malaysian rubber plantations and tire manufacturers in Britain faced competition because during the war, Japan and the US had also developed rubber and tire production. Now, with the war over, their factories switched to producing tires for civilian cars, which without protective barriers started being sold worldwide. So Britain found itself in a dilemma. Income from the colonies had decreased, while expenses remained or even increased, as maintaining power in the face of nationalist uprisings and workers' strikes was becoming increasingly costly. However, simply abandoning the colonies was not an option either, as communists would immediately take over, which London and Washington deemed unacceptable. Therefore, in the 1950s, Britain launched a war against insurgents in modern Malaysia and resettled Chinese people into guarded, isolated villages to prevent the spread of communist ideology. Once enthusiasm for communism waned, the British granted independence to the Malaysian Federation and allowed Singapore to hold parliamentary elections. Essentially, Malaysia was told to do as it pleased, while Singapore was still under British supervision but was allowed to start experimenting with democracy. Previously, Singapore was a typical colony where the governor was appointed by London and reported directly to the Crown. But now, Singapore was given the opportunity to conduct its own domestic policy, and the main political force in Singapore became these young fellas from the People's Action Party. If you look at photos of the party's founders, you'll see that none of them were even 40 years old at the time. Many of them were born into wealthy families of ethnic Chinese, whose parents had made fortunes during Singapore's rapid growth, especially after the opening of the Suez Canal, and one of these young men was Harry Lee Kuan Yew. At the time, many Chinese parents in Singapore gave their children British-style names, and for Harry, English was his native language. Having survived the Japanese occupation of Singapore during World War II, Harry moved to Britain, where he graduated from the London School of Economics and the University of Cambridge. In 1950, at the age of 27, Harry returned to Singapore with 2 honors degrees from British universities, one in economics and the other in law. Seeing what was happening in Singapore at that moment, Harry decided to enter politics and founded the People's Action Party. To avoid being associated with British colonization in the eyes of ordinary Singaporeans, he changed his British name Harry to the Chinese name Lee Kuan Yew. The People's Action Party was composed of people just like Lee Kuan Yew, young, educated, and from well-off families. They were all driven by a nationalistic vision to transform the former colony into a prosperous city. However, not all residents of Singapore were as educated and affluent as the PAP members, which led to a communication gap with voters, ordinary workers who literally spoke different languages. Singaporeans of Chinese descent, like those in China, spoke various Chinese dialects. Additionally, there were Malays and Indians who spoke only their native languages. To understand his voters, Lee Kuan Yew learned Malay and Tamil and fully mastered Chinese, as English had been his primary language before his political career. In these new languages, Lee Kuan Yew promised that voters in any country want to hear: increased wages, new jobs, housing, and accessible education and healthcare. The young, active members of the People's Action Party faced no real competition. For starters, because for decades, the British had ruled Singapore directly through their governors, leaving no room for a national political elite to emerge. Also, communists, who were the most politically active, had already been barred from participation. In addition, traditional politicians were associated with the British colonial administration, making them unpopular among voters. These politicians were seen as opportunists and part of a system that had long ignored the interests of the local population. And fourth, just imagine Singapore in the 1950s, a small city at the tip of the Malay Peninsula with no natural resources and no advanced technology. Singapore even had to import fresh water from neighboring Malaya. Its only resource was its people, 70% of whom lived in slums. You might ask, but wasn't Singapore a valuable port? Didn't people come from neighboring countries to make money? What happened was, after the collapse of the colonial system, Singapore's role as a transshipment hub rapidly declined. Previously, its warehouses were filled with rubber, pepper, and rattan from Indonesia and Malaya, which were processed, sorted, and shipped to Europe, fueling Singapore's growth and prosperity. Singapore had no place in the New World, where Indonesia and Malaysia had gained independence from their colonial rulers. The newly formed nations wanted to develop their own ports and trade directly with the world, bypassing Singapore. In such circumstances, there weren't many politicians eager to govern a poor, tiny country. As a result, in the first elections, 84% of parliamentary seats went to the People's Action Party. As the leader of the victorious party, Lee Kuan Yew became the country's prime minister at the age of 35. And since Singapore was a parliamentary republic where executive power lay with the prime minister, Lee Kuan Yew became the first independent leader in Singapore's history. The first thing Lee Kuan Yew did as prime minister was to propose a union with Singapore's closest neighbor, Malaya. His argument was that Malaya had vast land, while Singapore had a prime location for trade, so why not work together? Malaya agreed, and thus the Federation of Malaysia was born. It seemed that Singapore had become a part of a larger country with a bright future, but the federal government in Kuala Lumpur, the capital of Malaysia, began implementing a policy of national discrimination. During the colonial era, Malays had primarily relied on agriculture, while the Chinese and Indians, thanks to their language skills and connections with their home countries, engaged in more profitable trade. As a result, the federal government began equalizing the social status of the indigenous population by granting Malays business privileges, free university spots, job quotas in the civil service, and other advantages. These measures directly contradicted the policies of the People's Action Party in Singapore, where the Chinese made up the majority of the population. At times, this ideological conflict went beyond all limits. Malaysia, despite Singapore being part of the Federation, imposed trade barriers against it and restricted foreign investment, fearing competition. And there was reason to worry. If we look at GDP per capita, we see that in 1961, Singapore's was 3 times higher than Malaysia's. This was because Singapore remained the nation's most important port, even considering its decline after Britain's departure and the development of neighboring ports in Malaysia and Indonesia. After all, why sail around Indonesia when it was cheaper and safer to pass through the Singapore Strait? Thus, even in the early 1960s, Singapore's GDP per capita was significantly higher than that of its neighbors. This led to a deadlock in the conflict between the Malaysian government and Singapore's authorities. As a result of the Malaysian government's nationalist policies, the tensions in Singapore escalated, which the government in Kuala Lumpur used as a pretext to expel Singapore from the Federation. The reason was that Lee Kuan Yew's charismatic promotion of equality for all nationalities within the country was gaining increasing popularity among the Chinese population in Malaysia itself. Thus, at Kuala Lumpur's initiative on August 6, 1965, secret negotiations between Malaysia and Singapore took place, leading to the announcement of a new independent state. On August 9, 1965, Singapore became an independent country on the world map. Lee Kuan Yew announced this on television with tears in his eyes.
I had believed in Malaysian merger and the unity of these two territories.
Why did Lee Kuan Yew react so emotionally to what seemed like a joyous event, the independence of his country? Because Singapore was, in essence, an artificial creation of the British Empire. Without a powerful protector, the tiny state's chances of survival were minuscule. The foreign press called Singapore an unviable project, but Lee Kuan Yew did not give up and turned the city into one of the top 10 richest countries in the world. And next, you will learn the secret of this wealth. In the early 1960s, Singapore found itself caught between a rock and a hard place at the center of an armed conflict between Malaysia and Indonesia. To understand what these two countries were fighting over, take a look at the map of Borneo, an island located just east of Singapore. Around 300 ethnic groups inhabit Borneo, spread across the island. The British and Dutch, of course, didn't take this into account when drawing borders. As a result, many ethnic groups were split by these borders, much like what happened when Europe drew lines on the map of Africa. By 1963, the southern part of the island belonged to Indonesia, while the northern part consisted of British colonies. When the northern part announced its decision to join Malaysia, Indonesia took this step extremely negatively, as it laid claim to the entire island. The president of Indonesia declared that the Federation of Malaysia had been created in the interest of the West, not the people of the region. He dreamed of a greater Indonesia, and with Singapore at its center, he could not be excluded from this vision. Conflicts between the countries often escalated into open confrontations. For example, in 1965, Indonesian saboteurs planted a bomb in the building of Shanghai and Hong Kong Bank. When Singapore was separated from Malaysia, many politicians in Kuala Lumpur believed that not only should Singapore be forcibly reintegrated, but that the upstart Lee Kuan Yew should be removed and replaced with leaders loyal to the Malay government. In contrast to its aggressive neighbors, Singapore only had 2 regiments, each with about 1,000 soldiers, and most concerning of all, the majority of its military personnel were Malay. As a result, all of the People's Action Party's economic and social promises, such as high salaries and affordable education, were put on the back burner. The primary task was to ensure Singapore's survival. Although the British had a military base on the island, their stance was one of non-interference in the internal affairs of Singapore and Malaysia. Thus, Singapore had to figure out how to create its own army and train civilians in the basics of military service. But for this, money was needed, and the coffers were empty. The first step was to look for funds, not abroad, but within their own pockets. At the time, corruption flourished in Singapore, as it did in many East Asian countries. Corruption is especially harmful because foreign investments won't come in when everybody knows the money will be swindled. Lee Kuan Yew's first move was to reform Singapore's Corrupt Practices Investigation Bureau, which had been established by the British. Previously, the bureau dealt mainly with minor and mid-level offenses. For example, customs officials accepting bribes to expedite cargo processing or turn a blind eye to smuggling. Or street cleaners refusing to remove garbage unless shop owners or residents paid them extra. In short, the bureau mainly tackled petty corruption, common but not particularly dangerous at the state level. Meanwhile, the big fish were getting off scot-free. One well-known case involved Singapore's Minister of Education, who accepted about $700,000 from the Americans to support a pro-US party in the elections, ensuring a government loyal to Washington. The Bureau had no means to counter such figures, nor was it willing to, as investigating people in power was risky. So Lee Kuan Yew took direct control of the Bureau and gave its employees complete freedom. For low-level officials, the opportunity and motivation to take bribes were simply cut off. For example, at the time, Singapore's main roads were lined with small, unlicensed food stalls operating chaotically. Inspectors received salary increases, dedicated markets were built for vendors, and to simplify licensing, the government created a special committee to handle traders' complaints about violations. Within a few years, these unregulated markets disappeared, along with bribery in this sector. High-level corruption was tackled differently. Investigators from the Corrupt Practices Investigation Bureau were granted access to the bank accounts of not only suspect officials but also their relatives. If the funds in their accounts exceeded what a civil servant could legally earn, a judicial investigation was launched. For instance, in 1975, Singapore's Minister of Environment acquired a mansion worth $2 million, adjusted for inflation. Additionally, he had 300,000 Singapore dollars in his accounts, which he borrowed for stock market speculation. The investigation revealed that banks had issued this loan under the guarantee of a real estate developer, which had also paid for his mansion. The developer had rewarded the minister for facilitating the allocation of land for residential construction. Despite being a longtime friend of Lee Kuan Yew, the minister was sentenced to 4.5 years in prison. Lee Kuan Yew is often attributed with the quote, "To defeat corruption, you have to jail 3 of your friends," which he probably never said, but perfectly captures how order was restored in Singapore. Additionally, in 1966, Singapore's Auditor General was granted the authority to review any government and court accounts. He was accountable only to Parliament, and his reports were publicly accessible. Essentially, the government treasury became transparent, allowing anyone to see where the money was going. This system was progressive even by Western standards at the time, let alone for a third world country like Singapore. Singapore launched an all-out war on corruption and achieved remarkable success. The question remains, why can't other countries do the same? Because remember who formed the foundation of the country's power. Young, educated people with passionate hearts who did not need money and who had already been in power for 6 years by the time Singapore gained independence in 1965. All of them had prestigious higher education and, if they wanted, could find high-paying jobs outside politics. And to ensure that lower-ranking officials focused on their work rather than personal enrichment, Singapore established high salaries in public service. Lee Kuan Yew himself earned 29,000 Singapore dollars per month in the 1980s, while the Prime Minister of Malaysia received only 9,000 Singapore dollars, the President of Indonesia 2,500, and the President of Philippines merely 1,000. And so, the combination of high salaries and the inevitability of punishment made Singapore the 5th least corrupt country in the world, ranking ahead of Canada, Germany, Switzerland, and the United States. On the map illustrating this ranking, Singapore appears as the only bright spot in its region. However, an efficient and honest government alone does not bring economic growth. It is merely a strong foundation for it. That is why, for Singapore, with its puny economy and small domestic market, attracting foreign investment was crucial for survival, especially since the unemployment rate had reached a dangerous 14%, at which point the PAP could lose the people's trust despite all its achievements. So in the early years of independence, the Singaporean government jumped at every opportunity to create new jobs. For example, in 1964, the government appointed a local cinema mogul who owned more than 300 theaters and 6 amusement parks across Southeast Asia as the head of tourism. Who, if not him, would know how to entertain tourists? The first step in Singapore was to restore local historic districts such as Chinatown and Little India, as well as to organize night markets, tours, and festivals to attract tourists from neighboring countries. Of course, Singapore had to become a brand, and every brand needs a logo. That's how the city's symbol was created, a lion with a mermaid's tail. This was because Singapore translates from Sanskrit as the Lion City, and to emphasize the city's connection to the sea, the lion was given a mermaid's tail. To attract not only tourism but also foreign business, the government convinced entrepreneurs from Hong Kong and Taiwan to relocate part of their production to Singapore. But why move from Hong Kong and Taiwan to Singapore? Cutting labor costs wasn't an option since compared to its neighbors, Singapore already had a high GDP per capita. Singapore played a different card. As special agency was created for foreign investors so they wouldn't have to run around different offices or land leases or business registrations. They could do everything in one place. By 1975, the unemployment issue was nearly resolved. Thanks to foreign investment, the unemployment rate dropped from a critical 14% to 4.5%. Now that the country had money, the next challenge was ensuring its security against external threats. Over the years of economic reforms, Singapore was acquiring weapons and building an army, and a key role in this was played by another small state also established after World War II, Israel. Israeli military advisors actively assisted Singapore in forming and training its armed forces, and these two countries remain friendly to this day. In 1968, Singapore purchased 72 tanks and 170 armored personnel carriers from Israel. This equipment was almost immediately showcased at the Independence Day parade, causing an uproar in neighboring Malaysia, which at the time did not yet have tanks. A year after this parade, Singapore officially recognized Israel as a state, an especially bold move considering that neighboring Malaysia and Indonesia are Muslim-majority countries that still do not recognize Israel. This alliance with Israel effectively became Singapore's lifeline because at that very moment, Britain announced budget cuts by withdrawing its military bases from Asia within 3 years. This was a real disaster for Singapore, not only because the British Army helped maintain regional stability, but also because there were about 30,000 British military personnel stationed in Singapore. The military bases in Singapore created tens of thousands of jobs, and without them, the country's economy could have plunged into a severe crisis overnight. Just like 2 years earlier, Lee Kuan Yew had to solve a problem that could have nullified all efforts to build the state of his dreams. This is Malta, an island in the Mediterranean Sea that, just like Singapore, is located at the crossroads of trade routes and also gained independence from Britain shortly after World War II. Naturally, British military bases were also stationed there. And when in 1967, Britain began withdrawing its troops from Malta, Lee Kuan Yew flew to the island to observe how the process was unfolding. The local shipyard workers, the backbone of the island's industry, were modestly compensated by Britain for the loss of their jobs. The sight of Maltese workers, without a care in the world, playing water polo in an empty dock, which they had filled with water, made a huge impression on Lee Kuan Yew. This was just not the vision of Singapore that he dreamed of. The last thing Lee Kuan Yew wanted was, in his view, for ordinary Singaporeans to receive handouts that would undermine the country's independence and disrupt the delicate balance of the economy. So when a similar deal, compensation payments, and a smooth troop withdrawal was proposed for Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew declined and instead requested that part of the military equipment remain in Singapore. The British agreed, as it saved them the hassle of transporting and disposing of military assets and base infrastructure. Wanting to maintain strategic partnership, Britain allocated £50 million to Singapore, 1/4 as a grant and the rest as loans. This meant that Singaporeans who lost their jobs at British military bases did not receive direct compensation. Instead, the Singaporean government received funds, some of which were used to purchase British military equipment, while the rest was invested in repurposing military bases. Naval shipyards were converted for civilian ship repairs. Some former bases became student campuses, while others were transformed into tourist resorts. Singapore's military airfield was turned into one of the world's best civilian airports. And now, to become a truly prosperous economy, Singapore needed major Western investors. So in late 1968, Lee Kuan Yew flew to Harvard. There, he met with leading business school professors who played a role in shaping the Marshall Plan the creation of the International Monetary Fund, and the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. Their insights were crucial in helping Singapore attract large Western corporations. At the time, the world was experiencing another wave of transportation revolution, making international logistics cheaper. Previously, a direct flight from New York to Singapore was unthinkable. Planes couldn't travel such long distances, and passengers had to make multiple transfers. But now, flights were non-stop and took around 19 hours. More importantly, container shipping was becoming the standard in maritime logistics. Previously, workers unloaded ships with traditional cranes at a rate of 120 tons per hour at best, whereas 2 container cranes could unload 800 tons per hour. Lee Kuan Yew understood all this perfectly. Speaking at the Economic Club of New York before an audience of 800 businessmen and politicians, he presented Singapore as the perfect place for future investments. Lee Kuan Yew promised to do everything for investors, saying, "You can get a telephone connection with any place in the world in 5 minutes, and if you can't, let me know and I'll chop someone's head off." Such an approach was rare at the time. Many third world leaders believed that Western corporations were continuing a policy of colonial exploitation, taking away their resources. After Lee Kuan Yew's speech to New York businessmen in October 1968, a delegation from Texas Instruments arrived in Singapore. They were considering building a semiconductor plant on the island, semiconductors being essential for modern smartphones, computers, military radars, spacecraft, and virtually all electronic devices. To create the impression of an oasis for investors, Singapore was meticulously cleaned. Trees and bushes were planted everywhere, and parks and squares were developed. Rumors about Singapore spread among American businessmen, and articles about the country started appearing in Western business magazines. The final touch in shaping Singapore as an advanced and unique nation was making English language education mandatory. The government couldn't favor one of the 3 main local languages, Chinese, Malay, or Tamil, so English was chosen as a compromise that would unify the nation and teach it the international language of business. Gradually, schools and universities in Singapore transitioned to English language instruction. As a result, today, more Singaporeans speak English at home than Chinese. In fact, Singapore ranks 3rd in the world for English proficiency among non-native English-speaking countries. This widespread use of English made Singapore stand out among its Asian neighbors, granting it a massive financial advantage. Take a look. The European financial world wakes up at 9 AM Central European Time when banks in Zurich open. A bit later, banks in Frankfurt and then London follow. By evening, these banks start closing, passing the torch to New York and then San Francisco. Once the West Coast banks close, global finance comes to a standstill for about 8 hours until Swiss banks reopen. In practice, this meant that an American company couldn't transfer funds to its German suppliers because European banks were already closed. They had to wait until European banks resumed operations the next morning. This was the exact opportunity that Singapore recognized. When banks in San Francisco closed, Singapore's workday was just beginning, allowing its banks to receive financial flows from America and pass them on to Europe. This helped Singapore attract major banks like Citibank, JP Morgan, and Barclays. Vitally, in its pursuit of investors, Singapore carefully selected which banks could receive licenses to operate in the country. In 1973, a Luxembourg-based bank applied for a license, but was denied because it had just been established that year and lacked any reputation, even though its shareholders included the royal families of Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and the UAE. 7 years later, in 1980, the bank submitted another request, but Singapore once again refused based on negative assessments from central bank regulators in other countries. By then, the bank had 400 branches across 73 countries. Eventually, in 1991, due to numerous violations, the bank was liquidated and its clients lost their money. Thanks to such a selective approach, when the Asian financial crisis hit in 1997, Singapore's economy suffered far less than others. Just 3 years after the crisis, Singapore ranked 24th in the world for GDP per capita, right behind Germany and Canada, with nearly $24,000 per person. In comparison, neighboring Malaysia, which had parted ways with Singapore just a couple of decades earlier, had a per capita GDP of just over $4,000. Today, Singapore ranks 5th in the world in GDP per capita, and how people live in this country is a story worth telling separately. In 1993, the Singapore police arrested 7 teenagers for spray painting several dozen cars. One of them was a 16-year-old US citizen, Michael Fay. For vandalism, he was sentenced to 6 cane lashes on his soft spot. Even the intervention of the US President Bill Clinton did not overturn the verdict of the Singaporean court. As a sign of respect for good relations with the US, the President of Singapore reduced the amount of lashes from 6 to 4. A couple of months later, the punishment was carried out and Michael went back to the US. And there are plenty of punishments in Singapore that may seem excessive at first glance. For example, if you bring chewing gum into Singapore for sale without special permission, you'll be fined $70,000. This ban has been in place since 1992, and it might seem silly to you, but it was necessary to prevent vandals from sticking gum on the sensors of automatic doors in the subway, which could delay trains. Not only are the fines counted in hundreds of dollars, but Singapore streets are also patrolled by robots that monitor all violations. And even if a robot doesn't see you, cameras will. There are cameras on every corner. The only places with more surveillance cameras per capita than Singapore today are cities in India and China. You're unlikely to buy a car in Singapore. First, you need to win a special certificate at an auction to purchase a vehicle. The certificate is valid for 10 years, and its cost is often equal or even higher than the price of the car itself. This rule was introduced back in 1990 when the city began experiencing severe traffic congestion. As a result, after the introduction of the certificate system by 1994, the price of a Toyota Corolla in Singapore had reached about $50,000, while in the US, the same car cost only $15,000. Today, in a city with nearly 6 million people, only about 16,000 certificates are issued per year, making Singapore the most expensive place in the world to buy a car. Not like you would even need a car with a public transportation system considered one of the best in the world. As a bonus, Singapore also has one of the best healthcare systems in the region. Infant mortality rates here are not only lower than in neighboring countries, but even lower than in France, Germany, and the US. Listening to this Singapore success story, you might think the country was simply lucky, perfect geography, and good relations with powerful nations who did all the work. However, the same conditions did not help Sri Lanka, which in the 1950s was considered even more promising than Singapore. Lebanon, which until the 1970s was called the Switzerland of the Middle East, or Malta, the previously mentioned small island located along major trade routes. The key difference is that Singapore's leaders planned 2 steps ahead. Remember when I talked about how the country attracted semiconductor manufacturers in the late 1960s? Well, today, Singapore accounts for 11% of the global semiconductor market and 20% of the market for semiconductor manufacturing equipment. Since these semiconductors are used in almost all technology on the planet, forecasts predict that by 2030, this industry will double in size over 10 years, and with it, Singapore's economy will grow. And while in the 1960s, Singaporean officials were chasing foreign investors and convincing them to put money into Singapore, today, no. foreign investors are not chasing officials. Today, officials are chasing the world's top scientists, persuading them to work in the country's research institutes and enterprises. Leading British oncologist David Lane, who headed the Singapore Institute of Molecular and Cell Biology, described his experience with Singaporean officials as follows. They are very persistent people. They keep asking me, why did you agree to take on the leadership of the institute? What should we do to make you agree? And in the end, Lane agreed because all that any scientist wants is a well-equipped laboratory, a decent salary, and a strong team. Singapore could provide all of that. Following world-renowned scientists, global corporations and startups began flocking to Singapore. Today, in the ranking of countries by ease of doing business, Singapore ranks second, just after New Zealand. Thanks to Singapore's banking system, it's easy to access global capital here. A highly educated workforce allows companies to find talent quickly and drive technological progress. Meanwhile, the city's comfortable infrastructure and high standard of living make Singapore a desirable place to work and live, where the streets look like scenes from futuristic movies. So it's no surprise that tiny Singapore shares 7th place with Israel and South Korea in the number of unicorn companies, startups valued at over $1 billion. These numerous startups may not generate profits for years, but if even one succeeds, it covers the costs of all other investments. Then, these startups push Singapore's economy forward, growing into massive companies worth billions. For example, Drax, launched in Singapore in 2010, uses AI to analyze store shelf inventory and help retailers understand which products are in the highest demand. Today, Singapore-based Drax operates in 45 countries worldwide, serving giants like Coca-Cola. The story of Singapore is very much like a long-term game, where risky decisions were made. The country's authoritarian government has always chosen long-term goals, sacrificing short-term gains. After all, they didn't need to placate the voters by making popular but wrong choices. At one time, a large part of Singapore's Chinese population was furious when English was declared the official language. But without this decision, the country's competitiveness and attractiveness to the world today would be much lower. Of course, authoritarian governance is not unique to Singapore. Most countries on the planet are not democracies. But unlike other nations led by perpetual rulers, Singapore not only made the leap from the third world to the first, but also managed to stay there. By the way, Lee Kuan Yew voluntarily stepped down as Prime Minister in late 1990 at the age of 67 after 30 years in power. Why did he decide to leave after so many years? Well, the position of head of government didn't grant Lee Kuan Yew any privileges beyond a high salary. At the same time, it required tackling a massive array of daily tasks, and of course, carried enormous responsibility. Also, as early as the mid-1970s, through his interactions with top managers of American corporations, Lee Kuan Yew learned an important lesson. Investors closely monitor who is leading Singapore's government and how competent they are. For investors, it was crucial to understand that Lee Kuan Yew was still effective in his role as Prime Minister. From American business, he also picked up another idea. In many major US companies of that era, CEOs retired around the age of 65, leaving behind a well-established system capable of operating smoothly under new leadership. Lee Kuan Yew's book, on which we based the script, was completed in year 2000 with the following words: "What we have succeeded in over the past 3 decades does not guarantee that it will continue in the future. However, our chances will be higher if we maintain a merit-based promotion system, where the most deserving hold the best positions. The latter is especially important when it comes to the people leading the government."